All of the impacts of climate change that we have discussed so far will have impacts on the future of biodiversity conservation and the future of conservation targets. In this video, we will look to the future of area-based biodiversity conservation and the conversation shaping the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Last month, the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity took place in Kunming, China, in order to set the stage for next year's negotiations of the post-2020 biodiversity framework. It's important to note that this was a separate meeting from the more widely covered UN Climate Change Conference, or COP26, which was held in Glasgow, Scotland a couple of weeks ago. However, as we have been discussing, the links between climate change adaptation and conservation are important, so there are important links between the two meetings. The outcome of the conference in China was the Kunming Declaration, which includes a set of 17 commitments that will help shape the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which will hopefully be negotiated and adopted during the second part of the conference in the spring of 2022, which will again be held in Kunming. In this video, I will be referring to the Kunming Declaration regularly, as it is a key document that will shape the future of biodiversity conservation. We've spent a lot of time this week discussing conservation's role in the fight against climate change. But it's also important to point out that conservation is only one piece of the puzzle when it comes to dealing with climate change. Without directly confronting the causes of climate change and limiting warming to stay within a manageable range, conservation efforts will likely be futile. The Kunming Declaration actually recognizes this as it commits to working with ministries of finance and economy from around the world to end or reform subsidies and other incentives that encourage activities which harm biodiversity, many of which are also driving climate change. It also acknowledges that conservation actions are not a replacement for the urgently needed reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in a way that is consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Many experts will also caution that even if all of our conservation and climate targets for 2030 are met, there are likely still to be dramatic changes to the planet that will unfold over the next half-century because of delayed feedback loops in the planet's systems. This again points to our theme of the need to be highly adaptable in conservation and be willing to change direction as new information becomes available. When thinking about the future of biodiversity conservation, there are concerns around conservation target setting and how they are achieved. Throughout this course, we have talked about the differences between the political and scientific processes of conservation, and area-based targets tend to be one of those areas where this difference is the starkest. Over the last few decades, conservation targets have gotten increasingly ambitious, going from 10 to 12% in 1992 to the ever-growing movement of 30% by 2030. But there are some conservationists who will argue that this is not enough and that we have to think even bigger. In particular, there are those that subscribe to E.O. Wilson's idea of half-Earth, where 50% of the planet would be set aside for conservation. Others, though, think that we actually need to slow down. They will point out that with about 15.5% of terrestrial areas and 7.5% of marine areas currently protected, as a global community, we fail to meet the 2020 targets of 17% terrestrial and 10% marine protection under Aichi Target 11. If we can't even get to those targets, many have asked why should we try to double them in 10 years? There are also concerns around how we might reach these targets. Over the last few years, many experts have raised concerns about the quality of the protected areas network. Think about the paper that we read by Chris Lemieux and our discussions about how the Canadian government achieved its marine protection targets by reclassifying fisheries closures as OECMs. There are concerns that this trend, this focus on the quantity rather than the quality of protected areas, will continue and that it may even be amplified with increased targets as global leaders will be wanting to seen as taking action and keeping promises. Coupled with concerns over equity and poor enforcement, which we have touched on throughout this course, there are some serious concerns about the effectiveness of the growing protected areas system. So how do we do better? How do we improve the effectiveness of the protected areas system while simultaneously acknowledging and adequately dealing with the effects of climate change, as well as addressing the current shortfalls of the current conservation system? There are lots of different ideas about how to go about this, and we have tackled many of them throughout this course. But here I want to focus on a few key themes that are prevalent in conversations about the future of conservation. That other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, need to be properly incorporated into the system, that the approach to conservation needs to be more dynamic and adaptable, and that conservation needs to be more focused on outcomes rather than simple numeric targets. To do so, it will be essential to secure adequate financing, be climate smart, and to incorporate biodiversity conservation into a wide variety of policies. Let's look at each of these factors in a bit more detail. The last time that we discussed OECMs in this course, we were largely focused on how they can go wrong. Remember back to a couple of weeks ago in our discussions with Sarah on how the Canadian federal government uses its own definition of an OECM, which resulted in the country reporting a much higher marine protected area percentage than it probably should have. But we need to remember that OECMs are not inherently bad. They were added to the conservation lexicon as a way to formally recognize the contributions that areas outside of the state-controlled protected areas system make towards biodiversity conservation. Essentially, the goal of including OECMs in conservation is to fill in the gaps of the more formal system and to get a better picture of how conservation goals may be being met on the broader landscape. And based on the Kunming Declaration, they will be included in the post-2020 biodiversity framework. There is also an equity component to OECMs, as they can be managed by a wide variety of actors, including local communities, NGOs, the private sector, and Indigenous peoples. Remember back to our lecture on Indigenous approaches to conservation near the beginning of the semester. Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs, are Indigenous-led conservation initiatives that elevate the rights and responsibilities of Indigenous peoples and create more opportunities for self-determination in the management of their territory. They are also a type of OECM which will likely play a huge role in the future of conservation, and the Kunming Declaration emphasizes the importance of Indigenous and local peoples in meeting conservation goals several times. The dynamic nature of ecosystems has been a common theme throughout this course, as has the need to account for this dynamism in conservation planning. We have talked about the shift in attitudes in conservation from a focus on attempting to keep landscapes in a so-called pristine state to more of a recognition that landscapes are dynamic and in constant flux. For example, we have talked about how fire management changed over the course of the 20th century in North America. The initial focus on pristine wilderness management led to a suppression of the fire regime, but this approach rarely, if ever, resulted in its intended consequences, and in many cases, actually moved parks and protected areas into a state where they are primed for catastrophic fire. Today we recognize that this approach of fire suppression was a mistake, and that we work in a world that is constantly in flux. Therefore, conservation planners take the dynamic nature of ecosystems into account, which requires more monitoring of ecosystems, but also allows us to be more responsive to changes that occur within them through both natural and anthropogenic means. Throughout this course, many of you have questioned how useful conservation targets are in the grand scheme of things, as they have the potential to lead to a focus on the quantity of protected areas rather than their quality. While area-based targets are important for guiding the big picture thinking and planning about conservation, and they are an important tool in holding governments accountable to their conservation promises, your questions do highlight the need for conservation to focus more on the quality of protected areas. This need to improve the effectiveness of the global area-based conservation system is also included in the Kunming Declaration, although there is no guidance as to how this should look in practice. We have talked about many elements of what makes a quality protected areas system throughout this course, including the 3 R's: representation, redundancy, and resiliency. Representation means including the full range of habitat types and species in a protected areas system, because we want to make sure that all of our conservation efforts don't end up in the same type of habitat. We don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. Instead, we want to ensure that our conservation networks are as varied as possible to provide coverage for the widest variety of biodiversity possible. Although we don't want to focus conservation efforts too heavily on any one particular habitat type, we want to make sure that there is more than one example of each habitat type in our protected areas network. Not only does redundancy in the protected areas network increase the overall area of the network, it also provides a bit of a fail-safe in the system. So if something happens on one piece of a particular habitat, like a fire, it will still be represented in the network at another location. Finally, by resiliency, we mean focusing on those areas of the landscape that will help the landscape function and provide critical ecosystem functions in the future. This can be done by employing strategies like conserving the stage, which we discussed in an earlier video. It also means ensuring that our protected areas system is well connected, and the importance of connectivity is something that we have discussed many times in this course. Another common theme in this course is that conservation can be expensive, and that adequately supporting conservation means backing it up with the financial and political resources for it to actually be effective on the ground. In our reading led by Sean Maxwell from the University of Queensland, they note that the funding available for species protection has more than halved at the global level over the last 2 decades, so there's clearly work to do on this front. The Kunming Declaration also calls for an increase in the provision of financial as well as other resources to support conservation, especially in developing nations. Closer to home, funding for Canadian conservation has actually been increasing over the last few years, including through the Canada Nature Fund, which was announced as part of the 2018 federal budget. It is a $500 million fund that will be matched by partners, meaning that at least $1 billion will be available to fund conservation initiatives, including land acquisitions over 5 years, or to 2023. As we have talked about extensively this week, climate change will dictate the success of area-based conservation this century. Therefore, all of the strategies that we have talked about this week, from conserving the stage to safeguarding or restoring key spots for ecological integrity or connectivity, are essential. It is likely that conservation in the coming decade is going to look a lot different than it has over the last few years, as we learn about how to be more climate smart and how to better deal with the threats of climate change. Finally, throughout this course, we have discussed how compartmentalizing the landscape is a bit of a flawed approach to landscape management. It's also a very colonial approach to separate the landscape into places that are managed for biodiversity and places that are allowed to be exploited for human use. We also know that this isn't really how ecosystems work, nor does it really capture the dynamic nature of ecosystems. Therefore, we need to consider biodiversity in all landscape management decisions on the full spectrum of land uses, from wilderness and more rural settings, all the way to the places where people live and work. Furthermore, no matter how well resourced or managed a protected area is, it's only ever going to be able to deal with a small subset of biodiversity and a small subset of the threats that it faces. The threats to biodiversity, particularly those tied to climate change, are just too large and too widespread to be adequately addressed on a few postage stamps worth of land. Biodiversity needs to be considered in a wide variety of policies, including those that are more economically oriented, to move towards a more holistic view of landscape management. This is also a major theme of the Kunming Declaration, which calls for the mainstreaming of conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity into decision-making through a cross-sectoral approach.